Hello, my name is Richard Bällow. I'd like to thank you for your interest in an astronomical proof of the birth of Christ. I'm going to be reading most, if not all, of the slides that you see. However, I'm going to keep the slide on for 3 to 5 seconds after I finish talking. That way, you'll have the option of pausing and reading the slide in more detail if you wish. So there are 2 ways to enjoy this. You can listen to me and get the gist of what's going on and stop at any time if you want more information than what I'm telling you with my voice. Here we go. The word proof can be understood differently by different people. I thought it would be a good place to start defining some terms. On the internet at vocabulary.com, it defines proof as the evidence that shows something is true or valid when you show the logical steps that take you from your hypothesis, for example, that the world is round, to the conclusion that it is. You're formulating a proof. So, here is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that the birth of Christ was prophesied to the Magi by the angel Gabriel through Daniel in the form of several astronomical conjunctions involving Venus, Jupiter, and the star Regulus, which happens to be in the constellation of Leo. This prophecy was made 50 years before the conjunctions were seen in the sky of 430 and 429 BC. They were also seen again in the sky of 3 and 2 BC, when Christ was born. Both appearances occurred on specific sabbatical years, giving the Daniel 9 prophecy special significance in this proof. The evidence strongly suggests that the Earth, Venus, and Jupiter were initially placed in their orbits by the Creator for the purpose of producing all the conjunctions in the constellation Leo, precisely on the dates prophesied in Daniel 9. We will understand why this is by far the grandest birthday announcement ever made. Here we have several passages from the Bible that speak to the coming of Christ as a baby, dealing with time. For example, in Peter 1, at the top of the slide, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world. Daniel, in the middle of the slide here, Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding." And finally, at the bottom is Galatians. It says, "But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son." So there was a timing involved. It wasn't just at any old time that Christ arrived on earth. It was at a specific time. I'd like to take a moment and explain why this is important to me. Every planetarium show about the Christmas star that I've ever seen as a child, and including those that I presented as an adult much later in my life, always ended with a statement similar to this one. No astronomical object can stay over the place where Jesus was born. Thus, astronomy has no answer for this apparent miracle. Now, that's quite a dramatic ending to a planetarium show, to be sure, and it leaves the door open for God to work a miracle. I've pondered this scientifically unanswerable question about the star for over 50 years and believe there is a reasonable scientific answer for the star's unusual behavior of apparently standing still. Since the 1960s, I've pondered more generally as to the best scientifically acceptable explanation for the star. I am now confident that the explanation presented here is the best explanation because it provides reasonable answers to every attribute of this star. Drawing on an analogy from crime investigation, all the evidence collected should support the same conclusion. This is also true as we use this explanation to give reasonable answers for the narrative that is in Matthew 2, describing the star and the Magi and the birth of Christ. Let me first explain that this explanation of the Christmas star by the conjunctions we're going to be looking at is not new for me. It's been put on the web. It's been there for years. It's not new. Some years ago, this was thought about. But through the years, the Lord has uncovered many more convincing details about the explanation that, to my knowledge, are published only here. And of greatest interest is not how the star could stand over a place, but rather a much grander, scientifically unanswerable astronomical observation of the star that can be verified by anyone possessing a computer and Bible. They will discover that the only reason for the explanation is intelligent, supernatural placement of the planets Venus, Earth, and Jupiter in their respective orbits by the Creator. In short, we will discover that when God set the planets in motion, He also purposefully set into motion the grandest birthday announcement ever conceived. So here's the first of the verses in Matthew that we'll be reviewing to see what the attributes of the star were and explaining how they're very reasonable with the scenario that we're painting here. So Matthew 2:1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying. Now the star was seen while Herod was alive. That you can determine from this passage in the Bible. And his death has been taken from the writings of Josephus by most people as 4 BC for a lot of years. However, we're going to extend this date to 1 BC for the following reason. Josephus said that Herod died between a lunar eclipse and a Passover of the same year. Well, before the year 1552, published work by Josephus had Herod dying in 1 BC. After that year, 1552, it was changed to 4 BC. And when I've looked at the lunar eclipses in those 2 years, the one in 1 BC is by far much more impressive than the one in 4 BC. Besides that, as you can see in this excerpt from the web, there's some events that went on that better fit into the January 10th of 1 BC than in the 4 BC. So we're going to be looking now at a time that is as late as January 10th, 1 BC for the death of Herod and, of course, the end of the time that the Magi came to visit Christ. The Greek word magi describes a class of wise men and priests who were astrologers. Astrologers are defined as someone who predicts the future by the positions of the planets and the sun and the moon. Most likely Persian, descendants from Babylonian astrologers of Daniel's time, and from the east is consistent with the direction of Persia from Jerusalem. So I've put together several pairs of pictures of the sky of Leo. You can see the dates there in the bottom center of each one. The one on the left is Monday, August 5th of 3 BC, and it's in the morning before sunrise. You can see the darker sky that includes Leo's head, and the lighter below that is the rest of his body. The boundary between those two areas of each picture I'm going to show you is the dark sky at the top, and then the sun, which is below that. So the place where the sun rises then is the line between the darker upper half and the lower white half. The sun is shown just below Leo's front leg, and above Leo you find 2 planets labeled Venus and Jupiter. In the left photograph, they're a certain distance apart, not at all very close. In the right photograph, which is, count them, 5 days later, you can see that Venus and Jupiter are closer together. In fact, by looking at the right photograph, it appears as though Venus is the one that is moving faster than Jupiter to become closer together. Continuing on here, August 12th is on the left of 3 BC, and notice that Venus has caught up with Jupiter. So they appear to be one very bright object in the constellation of Leo. And the photograph on the right, you can see, is taken 5 days later than the one on the left. It's August 17th. And you can see that just on those few days, Venus has continued to move away from Jupiter, and they're no longer close together as they were on August 12th. So the time that they were together, indistinguishable from one another, was a very short time, perhaps a day or two before they separated. So the first conjunction was of Venus and Jupiter that we just saw in 3 BC. The next verse in Matthew 2, verse 2, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." A good question is, how did they know it was his star and not someone else's star? I believe they knew the star seen in the east in 3 BC was his star, as in Christ's star, because of the prophecy in Daniel 9. As we'll soon explain, the two conjunctions of Jupiter and Venus, and we've just seen one of them so far, plus the triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus, which we haven't seen yet in the sky. This is where Jupiter passes the star Regulus 3 times. It was sandwiched there between the two conjunctions of Jupiter with Venus. And all of this was prophesied by the angel Gabriel about 50 years before its first occurrence, to be seen in the year for the first time, 430 BC. It was obvious to them to go to Jerusalem to obtain the missing piece of the puzzle, specifically where he was to be born. There was no need for the first star, the one we just saw, that rose before the sun rose, to lead them to Jerusalem, since they already knew where to go to find that missing piece of information. Matthew makes it clear that it was the second appearance of the star that led them to Bethlehem, and I believe that was in 2 BC, and we'll see that in a moment. There was no mention of the first star leading them anywhere. Think about that. If you read the Bible, read it carefully, the first star did not lead them anywhere, regardless of the songs that we sing and the misconceptions that are out there. That first star that they saw did not lead them. It was the second star that led them to Bethlehem, the second time they saw it. Notice that this conjunction, the one we just saw with Jupiter and Venus, and all that follows will be taking place in the constellation of Leo. Now the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah, which is also a lion. Also, where it says they saw his star in the east, that means in its rising, consistent with the first conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in August of 3 BC. You notice we just saw on the slide before how the sun was below the horizon. That was visible for just a few hours at most before the sun would rise, the sky would turn blue, and you couldn't see any planets or stars. Notice this rather famous passage from Revelation. "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star." Now, what do you think? Do you think that the sun or the first conjunction of Jupiter with Venus, visible in the dawn sky, is better fit for this statement? Now, the star charts that we just looked at with Leo, Venus, and Jupiter occurred in 3 BC, and I believe that the information told to Daniel by the angel Gabriel was a prophetic announcement or statement as to when the celestial birth announcement would be seen in the sky at not one, but 2 different times. One of them in 430 BC and the other in 3 BC, the one that we just started looking at. The Magi of Daniel's time saw this celestial invitation over 425 years before it happened again when Christ was born. That's pretty amazing. We will prove that God planned the celestial announcement before the foundation of the world, as the passage from 1 Peter implies. Now, in this passage, the word time, which occurs in verse 4 and times in verse 20, means to perceive time quantitatively as a period measured by the succession of objects and events, and denotes the passing of moments. So there's definitely an implication here of timing of the arrival of Christ. Returning now to our star charts, you might recall we left off on August 17th. Now, on this view, the left of the two slides is 5 days later on August 22nd. And notice that Venus is even farther away now, and Jupiter is moving more slowly toward the star Regulus, right there where the front legs of Leo meet. And the one on the right is 5 days later on August 27th of 3 BC. And notice that Jupiter is even closer to the star Regulus. Once again, we're going to go through 5 days at a time. The star chart on the left is September 1st of 3 BC. Jupiter is even closer to Regulus. The one on the right is September 6th, 5 days yet future in 3 BC. And it looks like Jupiter is getting very, very close to Regulus. Notice on the left, on September 11th, Jupiter is very close to Regulus. And then on the right, on September 21st, Jupiter passes Regulus. Now we're going to move a month between photographs to speed things up a bit. The one on the left in October shows that Jupiter is farther away now from Regulus than before. And on the right, Jupiter is even farther away from Regulus. But now, kind of an unexpected turn of events. Look at the December star chart on the left. Jupiter appears now to be moving back toward Regulus. And 1 month later, in January of 2 BC, it's getting even closer to Regulus. Keep in mind now, when we go to the future and we're in the BC period, as the years move toward the future, they get smaller in number. February is on the left, February of 2 BC. Notice that Jupiter is once again next to Regulus, but it's moving in the opposite direction than it was before. And if we look at the next one on the right in March of 2 BC, it is past Regulus, again going in the, quote, wrong direction. If the right direction was from right to left, it's going left to right, backwards if you like. That's called retrograde motion. Once again, looking 1 month ahead in April of 2 BC, looks like Jupiter stops moving in retrograde from left to right and then backs up, now going in the forward direction, passing Regulus for a third time. Now to the Babylonians, this passage of Jupiter passing or having a conjunction with the star Regulus 3 times has special significance. From a book by Gavin White about the star lore of the ancient Babylon, he says, if Jupiter retrogrades in the vicinity of the king's star, which is Regulus in Leo, and thus passes it twice, it is as if the stars are sending a very specific message to the king. Someone will rise up, kill the king, and seize the throne. This prognostication is clearly derived from the planet's behavior, which by approaching the king's star twice over indicates the usurpation of of one king by another. Now, so far, we've seen a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus. Then we saw a triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. And now, looking at the left star chart, we're in June of 2 BC. And here we see Venus approaching Jupiter. And on June 7th, the star chart on the right, it's even closer. So what's going to happen? They're going to come together again for a second time to be so close together that they're indistinguishable in the sky. Both Jupiter and Venus will be very bright. Now, both of these star charts are in June 13th on the left, June 18th on the right. The one on the left has Venus and Jupiter becoming closer together, and then they become again so close they're indistinguishable in the right one, in the right star chart. So here we have the second conjunction of Jupiter with Venus. Now, both of these are the sky on June 17th. The one on the left is the time of 8 p.m., and the one on the right is 9 p.m. Now, notice where the sun is. The sun is now on the other side of Leo, so this is now an evening object. So this second conjunction of Jupiter and Venus occurs in the evening, can be seen after sunset. And you can see in that hour that elapses between the two that that Venus and Jupiter, being indistinguishably close together, is moving closer and closer to the horizon. Now, with our Sky Safari Pro astronomy program, we can look at this whole situation from the Earth, like from Jerusalem or Babylon, like we just did, or we can move out into space and look at the very same positions of the planets from a different perspective. So look carefully at the center of the picture. This star chart, rather, the sun is in the center. You've got the orbits of Venus and the Earth and Jupiter. Leo would be at the top and out of the scale of this photograph, so of this view of the sky. So Leo would be at the very top. And notice the date, August 13th of 3 BC. This is where we started with the first conjunction of Jupiter and Venus. Look carefully. The Earth, Venus, and Jupiter are in a vertical line, right? So they're lined up in the sky. So we live on the Earth, we're looking at Venus, and right next to Venus is Jupiter. Now, I'm going to put this in motion. It's going to happen rather quickly. You're going to see the planets moving around the sun. Now they're on the right side of the sun, which makes this a morning object. And they're going to move to the left side of the sun, which will make it an evening object. And they're going to be lined up again a second time, but in the evening. So here we go. Have a look. Now recall that we've seen a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus twice, once in the morning sky, again in the evening sky. And between those two, Jupiter made 3 passes or conjunctions with the planet Regulus. So why did Jupiter do that? Why did Jupiter stop its forward motion, back up, stop again, and resume its forward motion? The best analogy I can think of is when you pass a slower car on the road or on the freeway. Since you are in the faster car, the slower car, the one you're passing, appears to move backwards for just a short period of time. Of course, both cars are moving forward in the same direction the whole time, but it's an optical illusion. So in this example or analogy, the Earth is the faster car, Jupiter is the slower car. Although all the planets outside the orbit of the Earth will have this odd motion called retrograde motion, appearing to back up. We just saw Jupiter do that. This happens when Jupiter and every time the Earth passes Jupiter, about once a year. But since Jupiter is also moving around the Sun, it retrogrades, or does this passage Regulus, roughly once in 3 years. Now notice the same view looking up from above of our solar system. I've drawn a straight line from the Earth to Venus and to Jupiter. This is, as you can see, August 12th of 3 BC. That's the first Jupiter-Venus conjunction. Now we're going to set this in motion. And when I do that, you're going to see this line turn red, and which means it's just looking at Jupiter now, the Earth looking at Jupiter in the sky. Keep in mind that Leo is out of the picture at the very top, the star Regulus being out of view in this scale. But when you see that red line first appear and watch the video, you'll see that it will tilt more and more to the left, and then it'll tilt to the right. That's going backwards, called retrograde. Then in the very last, when it's lined up again on the other side of the Sun, that red line will be moving the way it normally did at the beginning, which is forward or prograde. And it will end, this video will end with another blue line showing the second conjunction of Jupiter and Venus on the other side of the Sun. So here we go. Now, a major point here must be made to understand this thoroughly. The parade of the planets had a definite order, both in 430 BC, as we'll see, as well as in 3 and 2 BC. The first one is that Jupiter and Venus were in conjunction, close together now, in the constellation of Leo. They were too close to distinguish as separate planets. They looked very bright together for a few days just before dawn in the east. Then, the second thing that happened is that Jupiter passed the star Regulus in Leo 3 times. Jupiter appeared to back up in this retrograde motion we just explained. Finally, the third thing is that Jupiter and Venus will come together again in conjunction a second time in Leo. Also too close to separate, but now visible after sunset on the other side of the Sun in the west for about 3 hours. Now, in all of this, notice the importance of Jupiter. Jupiter is the main planet interacting with the other celestial objects. Jupiter was involved in every step of those three. And it really makes you wonder when you get on the internet and you search for Babylonians and calculus. It appeared as though Babylonians invented calculus. We're talking thousands of years before we thought anyone used calculus. And they used it to track Jupiter. First appearing in the journal Science, they translated some Babylonian records. And basically what the Babylonians did was they wanted to know the exact motion of Jupiter in the sky. Quite a coincidence, or perhaps cause and effect from our last slide, where Jupiter was very important to all of those three motions in the sky that we just talked about. What they did basically was that they took 2 observations of Jupiter at specific times. They plotted a graph. They figured the area under the graph is where the calculus comes in. And they used that to predict future positions of Jupiter. Interesting, don't you think? Returning now to our narrative in Matthew, the 3rd verse, chapter 2, it says, "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." Now, the news of a new king was a surprise to Herod and all Jerusalem because they were not considering the possibility of a new king. Would you be troubled if someone came to where you worked and asked to see your replacement and you had no knowledge of that? Even if they knew of the triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus, they were probably unaware of the Babylonian omen that we just read about, that when Jupiter passes Regulus several times, this means a change in kingship. Nor was Herod likely aware of this omen because he was an Edomite. He was not Babylonian. Continuing on in Matthew, verses 4 through 6, gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea. And so it's written by the prophet Micah. And that is what the missing piece of information was for the Magi. They did not know where he was to be born. So this is apparently the only piece of information the Magi did not have. So they needed to ask. Recall that we talked about questions and how important they are. Look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 7. It says, Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. Evidently, Herod didn't see it. He had to ask about it. But where was this secret place? Probably, I believe, not at Herod's palace in Jerusalem, since that would not be considered private. Herod probably met with them in a place more private than the Jerusalem palace that he had, not far from the temple itself, but still close to Bethlehem, perhaps at his hilltop palace built in 23 to 20 BC, located about 3 miles as the crow flies, really closer to 5 miles by the winding road east of Bethlehem called the Herodium. Again, we see that Herod did not see the star for himself. He had to ask the Magi when it was visible. This is reasonable because the first conjunction was only visible for a few hours before sunrise. Then the brightness of the daytime sky hides the dimmer planets and stars. Couldn't be seen in the daytime then after that. Also, it appeared as one star for only a few days before Jupiter and Venus would separate. No longer one bright star then. Unless Herod was looking eastward before dawn, he would not have seen the star. So here's a map from Google Earth where I've circled the Herodium. It was a hilltop palace. In fact, the hill was the palace itself. On the bottom of the picture, circled by the yellow line. And then at the top is Bethlehem. And I've also included the Church of the Nativity, which is the traditional location of where Christ was born. Notice the north arrow there in the lower left corner. I believe the Herodium, as the secret place, makes more sense than Jerusalem does. If the Magi met with Herod at his palace in Jerusalem and left from there following the star at the bearing of roughly 297 degrees, that's where it would be after the sun set. That's the part of the star that they saw that led them to Bethlehem. Well, they would never reach Bethlehem if they left from Jerusalem. But if they left the Herodium on that bearing of 297, they would have been headed right toward Bethlehem. So the second conjunction of Jupiter and Venus is in the right direction to lead them from the Herodium to Bethlehem. Here is another view from Google Earth showing the Herodium there at the very bottom, next to the M in Herodium, at the bottom of the view. The arrow from there, 297 degrees, is the bearing of Jupiter and Venus in its second conjunction in the evening there of June of 2 BC. Notice the north arrow at 360 degrees. The way these numbers work is north is 0, and then if you go clockwise from north, you come to east at 90 degrees, and then south at 180. 270 would be east, and then back to 360 for the direction north, or back to 0 again. Now notice Jerusalem there in the upper right corner. If they were in Jerusalem and left Jerusalem to follow the star at 297 degrees bearing, it would take them away from Bethlehem, not toward Bethlehem. But from the Herodium, It takes them right to Bethlehem. Let me explain where that bearing of 290 some degrees came from. You'll notice in this star chart of Leo, look at the date there, June 17th of 2 BC. Notice Jupiter and Venus are really close to the horizon, just about setting. The horizon is that horizontal line. And look at the purple arrow in the upper left corner. That is the direction that we are looking, 291.8 degrees, it says there, plus or minus 5 degrees or so of the second conjunction. So this is the direction that the Magi followed if they were following this star to where Christ was born. Returning to our narrative in Matthew, verses 8 and 9, and he sent them to Bethlehem, this is Herod, and said, "Go, search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him." After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star, which they had seen in the east, remember the conjunction, first one was visible before sunrise, it went on before them. So they saw it again in the evening now on the other side of the sun. Still Venus and Jupiter, too close together to tell. So it went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Now, just as a mention here, the distance of 5 miles to Bethlehem by road from the Herodium, traveling by camel at a speed of between, let's say, 3 to 5 miles per hour, are reasonable to arrive in Bethlehem. If the Magi started at the Herodium shortly after sunset, which was at 6:30, they would have arrived in Bethlehem at 9:30, just in time to see the star, which is Venus and Jupiter together, set. Notice that they saw the same star again. This time it led them to Bethlehem. Again, recall that both stars were Jupiter and Venus, one in the morning and one in the evening, so close together that they appeared as one bright star. They were both the same thing, although seen at different times. One in the morning, disappearing as the sun rose, and the other later one visible from sunset to about 9:30 in the evening. Now in verse 10 of Matthew chapter 2, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. A great question is why? Well, it's because they were now seeing the same star that they saw in the morning sky. It's now in the evening sky, which was reassuring to them that they were on the right track. In other words, the star had returned. Perhaps because the answer to their question of where will he be born, Bethlehem, is right where this second conjunction was leading them. It agreed. In other words, the star's leading coincided with Bethlehem, the newly acquired piece of their puzzle. This is only possible, recall, if they're traveling from the Herodium toward Bethlehem, not possible if they were traveling from Jerusalem to Bethlehem and following the star. As we will explain shortly, this same conjunction in the evening sky occurred back in 429 BC, so their excitement may even be due to another reason, which is the final anticipation of the conjunction as they understood it, or at least it was passed down to them from their descendants as they saw it in 429 BC. Now here we get to the star stopped. How could the star stop? Well, notice the star stopped above the place where the child was. That's how it's worded. The traditional location is the Church of the Nativity, located on Star Street, of all names. It's the yellow line in this Google Earth image, as you see below. It happens to be the oldest street in Bethlehem. The word stopped, though, can mean to stop, such as to no longer be seen. In that context, when the star, which was Jupiter and Venus close together, set below the horizon in the northwest at a bearing of, let's say, 297, 298, 288 in that area there, degrees of bearing, as seen from the green dot that you see there on the photograph on Star Street, it would no longer be seen. It would have disappeared behind the Church of the Nativity. Keep in mind, I keep in mind anyway, a verse of the Bible that's so cool. It's Proverbs 16:9. It says, "The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." To be sure, if God wanted the Magi to be at a certain place at a certain time, God can do that. Has no problem with that. Verse 11, after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures. They presented to him the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, the travel time from Babylon to Jerusalem is also reasonable with this explanation. Assuming the Magi observed the first planetary conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in August of 3 BC from Babylon, and they waited for Jupiter to pass Regulus for the second time in February of 2 BC, before starting their nearly 900-mile journey, 4-month trip to Jerusalem from Babylon. It's reasonable because it took Ezra and a caravan he was traveling with 4 months to traverse the nearly 900 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem. So it's been done before, and the time we have is a reasonable time when you consider the stars' positions and the time between them involved. They would also arrive in Bethlehem 4 months later in June of 2 BC, when the second Jupiter-Venus conjunction occurred. Not only is the timing reasonable, but it explains why the Magi expected to see a new king, according to the Babylonian sky lore, the triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. You might recall I said that every aspect of the star can be explained. Even Mary's length of pregnancy is reasonable. If the first Jupiter-Venus conjunction in 3 BC coincided with the beginning of Mary's pregnancy, that's when the Venus and Jupiter were just rising ahead of the sun, seen early in the morning, and also assuming she delivered at 40 weeks, then when the Magi arrived in Bethlehem at 44 weeks and 1 day after conception, Jesus would have been about 4 weeks old, leaving a 12-day window before Mary and Joseph left Bethlehem for her purification at the Jerusalem temple. And again, notice the wording there in verse 1 now of Matthew chapter 2. It says, now after Jesus was born. So the Magi came after he was born. In this case, he was only a few weeks old. And what about the shepherds that visited Jesus? Of course, the shepherds must have visited Jesus before Joseph and Mary left Bethlehem. I mean, they couldn't visit him if it wasn't there. The June time frame, the second conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, makes sense since the shepherds watch their flock closely when the lambs are born in the spring, and that occurred in the spring in June. So Jesus was not a toddler, as some would believe, but was most likely less than 40 days old when the Magi and the shepherds visited Jesus, because Joseph and Mary left Bethlehem and went to the temple in Jerusalem for Mary's purification and sacrifice that was required to be done in the temple no earlier than 40 days after his birth, specified there in the Old Testament in the book of Leviticus. Luke chapter 2, verse 39 states that from the temple they went to Nazareth, without any reference of returning to Bethlehem for the Magi's visit. If this is so, he must have received the Magi's gifts and had the shepherds visit before going to the temple. And then they left from the temple to go to Nazareth. Joseph's modest sacrifice that he gave at the temple is no problem at all, even though they had all of the treasures from the Magi, because he was truly poor. The gifts, recall, were belonging to Jesus, to Christ, not to Joseph. Even Herod wanting to kill children 2 years and younger, even that makes sense with this explanation. Looking at verse 12, it said, and having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had been determined from the Magi. So let's look at the details here. If the meeting between Herod and the Magi occurred on June 17th of 2 BC, at the Herodian there, they would have had replied to Herod's question in Matthew 2:7 that they saw his star about 10 months earlier on August 13th of 3 BC. So Herod would have chose an age of young boys to slaughter that would have been more than the length of 10 months, to be sure. 1 year is cutting it close, 12 months. So perhaps he chose 2 years old just to be sure that he would get Jesus. Now, so far, all this I think is really quite interesting. The explanation just explains every attribute of the star that you can read from Matthew. But there's much more about this parade of planets to explain. Perhaps the most interesting details are yet to come. If we go to Daniel chapter 9, verse 25, we read this. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So 2 great questions to ask is, who made the decree that they're speaking about, that Gabriel's speaking about here to Daniel? And when was this decree made? And what does the word weeks refer to? Great questions. We're now going to introduce the Sabbatical year. Here's some background on it. In Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 7, it talks about this time required by the Lord as he spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. And in the yellow here it says, but during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. Your harvests after growth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. So it was a rest period every 7 years, and that was called a sabbatical year. Now, if you're wondering how on earth could they live not attending and harvesting their crops for a year, the Lord promised to give them ample harvests in the previous years before the 7th year, so they would have plenty stored away, and they would not at all be in want of food. Now, not only are we going to talk about what is a Sabbath year, we just did that, but we're also going to be looking at the penalty that God had for the nation of Israel should they not observe the sabbatical years. And so in verse 27 it says, yet in spite of this, you do not obey me, but act with hostility against me, then I will act with wrathful hostility against you, and I, even I, will punish you 7 times for your sins. Verse 33, you, however, I will scatter among the nations. This starts the exile to Babylon. And in verse 34, then the land, while they're in Babylon, will enjoy its Sabbath all the days of the desolation. While you are in your enemy's land, that's Babylon, then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the days of desolation it will observe, and rest which it did not observe on your Sabbaths while you were living in it. So the implication there in red, the bottom of the screen, is that the length of time of the exile is equal to the time that Israel did not observe these sabbatical years. Returning to an earlier section of Daniel chapter 9, it says, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah, which we just read. Jeremiah the prophet, for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So this time was nearing an end, and Daniel now was praying to God and explaining the sins of the nation of Israel, asking for forgiveness and grace from God. And his prayer is pretty impressive. It's reading where the yellow begins here. Open shame belongs to us, O Lord, to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong compassion and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him. Nor have we obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in his teachings, which he set before us through his servants the prophets. Indeed, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, not obeying your voice. So the curse has been poured out on us, along with the oath which is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, for we have sinned against him. And then verse 13, also in red, near the bottom. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come on us, yet we have not sought the favor of the Lord our God by turning from our iniquity and giving attention to your truth. Therefore the Lord has kept the calamity in store and brought it on us. For the Lord our God is righteous with respect to all his deeds which he has done, but we have not obeyed his voice. Spoken with a very contrite heart, asking for God's grace. Now, in the NASB translation, it's called a decree. It's called a command in the King James Version. But there's two pieces of evidence that points to Ezra, chapter 6, verses 6 through 12, as the decree, or the command, if you like, that is mentioned in Daniel. And here's the two pieces of evidence. Number one, since the plaza and the moat are mentioned in Daniel, the latest decree is most likely to allow enough time to build those things. It takes time to build them. But the second one here is really amazing. The decree was marked by distress and oppression. That's at the end of Daniel 9:25. Distress and oppression. Let me make a further point of this reading from the King James Version. Daniel 9:25 says, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And the Net New English Translation Bible calls that distressful times. Now, this is translated from the Hebrew, it's Old Testament, and the word troublous is Strong's number 6695. Strong's is a book of definitions of the Hebrew and later on the Greek and the New Testament as well in Strong's manuscripts. But Strong 6695, it describes a condition of political, military, and religious oppression on God's people. He even cites Daniel 9:25 for that in the definition. But it also says, in yellow here, it says it describes a period of personal, emotional, economic, or spiritual distress or anxiety that assails a person that only wisdom can deliver someone from. Now let's see if you agree with me. This is so cool. The rebuilding of the temple is questioned by a governor. Paraphrasing here, this guy comes up and says, What are you doing? In the yellow here it says, Who issued you a decree to rebuild this temple and to finish this structure? He is causing some grief to these people. They're working hard. He comes along and says, Who are you to do this? In verse 5 there in yellow it says, But the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until a report would come to them from Darius. So this governor didn't stop. He just questioned, and through the hand of God, they waited for a decree from Darius that was actually done earlier, a written reply to be returned concerning the building of the temple, that they do have the permission from Babylon to do this. So the ensuing investigation resulted in a verification of the older decrees, which is so cool. What this governor did was he questioned them, and to solve that problem, they asked for, let's go back to Darius and see what he said. Can you do this? And here's what they returned with. So here is what the decree of Darius that they went to get. This is what it said. And again, it's all written by Darius. But it says to them, to this governor, leave this work on the house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, he issues, and it goes on and on with what he's going to provide for them. And then in yellow it says, I, Darius, have issued this decree. Let it be carried out with all diligence. Isn't that cool? So what turned out to be what are you doing? You can't do this. Something to be concerned about. Turned out to be something very positive. It was a verification again of what Darius wanted them to do, to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem. Notice the date there near the bottom of the page. This is 470 BC. That is significant. So reading in Ezra 13 through 15, a significant part there is in yellow, and it says, and they finished building according to the command of the God of Israel and the decree of who? Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Wow, that's pretty cool. It tells you when it was finished, and that turns out to be 467 BC. So I believe the decree referred to in Daniel 9:25 is most likely the one that's in Ezra 6 through 12. It was dated at 470 BC. It turned out the year 470 BC is a sabbatical year on the Hebrew calendar. Now, we're going to count the sabbatical years from the year of this decree to determine what happened on the 7th and also on the 62nd sabbatical year. Because Daniel 9:25 states, so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree that we've just discovered to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It'll be built again with plaza and moat, even in the times of distress. Now, typically over the years, those weeks have been defined as years. But we're going to look at it differently, and we have a good reason to. If we define 7 weeks as meaning 7 sabbatical years, now recall how important the observation of the sabbatical year is to God. Perhaps the 7-year period, which simply means 7 of something, such as weeks, representing 7 days. What if it actually represents 7 sabbatical weeks? And the 62 weeks represents 62 sabbatical weeks. In other words, we're talking 7 groups of 7 years and 62 groups of 7 years. That'll total the time, pretty close to the time anyway, when Israel failed to observe them. That 70-year period of exile, equal to the time when they did not observe the sabbaticals when they lived the sabbatical years in Jerusalem. I'm not alone in this. Others believe that the weeks are sabbatical years, not actual years of time. In a paper that's described here, they're agreeing that the weeks in Daniel 9 deal with sabbatical years. So it's not unusual to define the week that way. It really means heptad, which is a group of 7. Now we're going to be counting down these sabbatical years. We're going to find the 7th and the 62nd of these things. And the diagram we're going to use has 2 columns, ZM and WH, which are simply 2 authors who saw the reckoning of these sabbatical years differently. They're only 1 year off, but you can read that if you like to get more insight as to why they're different. But a single year off isn't going to make much difference for what we're doing. And this is one of 2 slides showing the sabbatical years. You can see the Julian calendar date on the left column, and it's actually the green part is the heading of these things. So we've got, for any one of those green horizontal lines, it has the Julian date, It has the two other day counts of those two other authors, and then it goes on again. And it's kind of a zigzag portion. You just look at the dates and go increasing with them. So if we find 471 BC on the left, it's kind of split between these two interpretations of what date it should be for a sabbatical year. But notice I've got Decree of Ezra, 6 verses 6 through 12 with a red arrow. That's the first sabbatical week. Then the next, and by the way, I've made the sabbatical years all in blue. So all we do is count the blue sections in order, which is kind of zigzagging up and down the pages here. But the red number 1 on the blue is the first sabbatical year from the decree. The one with the yellow, or with the red 2 in it, is the second sabbatical year. Then there's the third one, again, looking at how these numbers go up and down, repeating in an increasing way. The fourth one is down on the left, the fifth one below that, the sixth one in the middle, and the seventh one finally. Now look what year that is. That seventh one is the year 430 BC. Where have we seen that before? Yes, that was the conjunctions of Jupiter and Venus and the triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus, right? The first one, not when Christ was born, but 400 and some years before that. And that also marks the first sabbatical year of the 62 sabbaticals. So counting now the blue sabbaticals with the yellow numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll let you kind of follow those down. You get all the way down on the lower right corner there to 57, right? And then it will continue in the next slide. 57 was the last one we saw on the last slide. 59, 60, 61, and look at 62. 62 is the sabbatical year of Christ's birth, 3 and 2 BC. That's pretty amazing. So the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks turn out to be, when you count them as sabbatical years, turn out to be the same two astronomical alignments that were identical. Now here's what I mean by identical. I have on the left the 3 BC star chart with Jupiter and Venus before they come together for the first time, for the first conjunction. And then on the right side of the page, I have the 430 BC star chart with Jupiter and Venus about in the same position, pretty close. I'm going to run one video at a time, and I want you to see how close they are. They are going to start where they are with Jupiter and Venus apart, but you're going to see as each one goes, Venus is going to catch up to Jupiter for the first conjunction. You're going to see Jupiter pass Regulus 3 times in retrograde, and then it's going to end up with Venus and Jupiter again being in conjunction in the evening sky. Okay, so watch these two one after another. They are amazing to watch. So using Sky Safari Pro and Google Earth, the software we've used, we can actually see what the Magi saw, the result of what God planned before the foundation of the world. In fact, when God created the heavens and the earth, he must have placed the planets in their orbits exactly where they needed to be to make the grandest birthday announcement in all history, providing reasonable explanations for all the attributes of the star recorded in Matthew chapter 2. In other words, those planets would not have been in those positions at those times of those 2 sabbatical years, unless they were purposefully put there to be there at that time, intelligently, supernaturally placed in their orbits. That's cool. And recall our second purpose, besides thinking, it was to see that God is even more awesome than we can imagine he is. In Psalms 19:1, it says, "The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanses declaring the work of his hands." He is the one that put the planets in orbit around the sun in just the right places to tell everyone about the birth of his son. That is awesome. My email is on the first slide. If you wish to contact me with any concerns, corrections, please do so. Thank you.